This Austrian Grand Prix weekend review has been given a 5-second time penalty for track limits. Come back in a few hours and let's see where we end up. What's going on, guys? Welcome back, and this is my 2023 Austrian Grand Prix weekend review. It was a wild weekend. It was our sprint weekend in Austria around the Red Bull Ring in Spielberg. It was quite actually a pretty good weekend all in all, and we saw probably one of the most heavily scrutinized Grand Prix that I know that I've ever seen. But for now, let's go ahead. We'll jump on into it. We're going to do our race weekend quick hits, our winners and losers for the Red Bull Ring this weekend, and we're going to go over my predictions that I made pre-race weekend and see how we did. But for now, let's go ahead and jump on into it. We're going to go ahead and start off with our weekend quick hits. Normally this would be reserved for the race quick hits, but since it was a sprint race weekend, let's go ahead. Let's talk about the sprint, which I think, in my opinion, may have been the best race that we've had so far this Formula One season. I know it was only 24 laps around the Red Bull Ring, but we saw changeable conditions, a difference in strategies depending on where you were in the race, and I think it might have been one of the most interesting to see from a spectator's point of view so far this year. We saw a multitude of drivers in the top 8 or so refuse to pit for slicks with about 5 laps remaining, just determined to keep track position and play that game, while some of the others further down the grid, maybe just on the outs, decided to risk it all, pit for slicks, and see if they could make up some ground. I want to give a special shout out on this channel for Nico Hulkenberg, starting in P4, ended up running in P2 for a little bit of the race before the inters absolutely fell off, and he found himself down in P6, where he made probably the best decision he could have made in that Haas car, which I think eats rubber like Americans eat McDonald's. He ends up pitting for mediums and running mediums until the end with about 5 or 6 laps left. He ends up dropping outside the top 10, but charges back through the field and finishes in his original position of P6, bringing home 3 points for a Haas team when points are always going to be tough to come by, and it was a special performance from the Haas driver. Otherwise, we saw a Max Verstappen, Sergio Perez 1-2. Carlos Sainz joined on the sprint podium in P3, and it was honestly a pretty good day all around for Aston Martin in terms of the sprint. Lance Stroll and Fernando Alonso finished 4-5. Nico Hulkenberg P6, and Esteban Ocon and George Russell ends up coming all the way through the field from P15 to finish in the points by bagging a single point, finishing in P8. It was a really fun sprint race to watch, and I hope we get more of those in full Grand Prix rather than sprint races, but at the end of the day, I'll take good racing when I see it. So a very, very fun sprint race. Then proceeded a 71 laps around the Red Bull Ring, and this turned out to just be track limits exceeding simulator, as we saw. I can't remember the exact amount, but we saw an enormous number of drivers penalized for breaching track limits around the Red Bull Ring. I think they saw on Twitter about 1,200 instances or reports of drivers exceeding track limits, and we saw probably one of the strangest things that I've seen so far in watching Formula One for this year and a half. I have been so far, which is about 5 hours after the race ended, and we saw a multitude of penalties handed out post-race. And shout out Esteban Ocon for accumulating 30 seconds of penalties on his way towards dropping. I think he wasn't in the points to begin with, but he ends up dropping below a further few places, and it was an odd situation. We saw Lewis Hamilton get a penalty on lap 17, and we saw, I think in the race, 5 or 6 drivers end up with penalties, and when it was all said and done, I think I saw 10 or 11 ended up getting penalties to some certain degree. Carlos Sainz, I think, might have been the biggest loser out of all of them. He was finished in P4 behind Sergio Perez and P3 on the podium, and ultimately ended up dropping to P6 after a 10-second penalty was awarded to him post-race. And so Carlos had a fantastic weekend overall, and it was kind of tough to see him kind of penalized like that after the race was well in hand. Lewis Hamilton ended up with another 10-second penalty, which ended up swapping him positions with George Russell. They finished P7 and 8 respectively. Lando Norris, I think, might have been driver of the day, both in the fan vote, and might be the driver of the weekend. Kind of up there with Carlos Sainz as well. Lando ends up finishing P4 after all of the penalties are dished out, and so that's a huge result for the McLaren driver. Special shout out to Charles Leclerc finishing P2 in the Grand Prix. I think he's been due for another good result. He's been kind of struggling here of late, and so to see him finish on the second step of the podium is pretty fantastic for them. All in all, kind of looking elsewhere, Mercedes and Aston Martin kind of looked well off the pace. I know that Aston had a pretty okay finish in the sprint race, and they ended up finishing, Fernando Alonso ends up finishing P5, and Lance ends up getting promoted to P9 in the Grand Prix itself. But they just never looked quite on the pace that Red Bull and Ferrari were from the whole weekend itself. And so a tough weekend for them. They're hoping to really dig in at Silverstone next weekend to really grab hold and take advantage of these upgrades that they've been bringing. Looking further down the field outside of the points, shout out to Williams. Alex Albon had another fantastic weekend, I think, ultimately finishing just outside the points in both the sprint as well as the Grand Prix, finishes P11. And also special shout out to Logan Sargent finishing P13, even with a 10-second penalty he got after the race finished. But he holds on to P13, and I think that might have been one of his best finishes so far this year. So he got the upgrades, and it was nice to see him kind of put it all together and get one of his better results on the year. So a special shout out to him. Looking else down the field, I mean, Haas had an absolute nightmare. Nico Hülkenberg had his engine blow up about 10 laps in, so that was a bit unfortunate for him after such a great sprint race. And Kevin Magnussen kind of finished in P18 ultimately, just couldn't seem to get it going. That Haas continues to eat tires for breakfast. AlphaTauri also had a rough weekend. Yuki has been very consistent, running just outside the points so far this season, but around the Red Bull ring, it just didn't look like that AlphaTauri could hold up that well. So all in all, it was a very, I think, still a pretty good race. We saw great battles in the sprint race as well as in the Grand Prix. Specifically, the Carlos Sainz and Sergio Perez battle down the stretch was particularly exciting. Carlos gave Checo all he could. I think he helped secure P2 finish for Charles Leclerc. So Carlos playing the ultimate team game, and ultimately, unfortunately, with his penalty, gets docked the most for it as he finishes down there in P6. But all in all, it was a great race weekend, and if I was gonna rate the Grand Prix itself, I'd probably give it about a 6. If we could throw in the sprint there with it, I think it's about an 8 in terms of the weekend. Qualifying was exciting, and there were nonstop moments from start to finish. And so I think, honestly, this might have been up there for one of the better race weekends as a whole so far this season. And so we're hoping to continue this as we move to Silverstone next week. But now, let's go ahead. Let's jump over to our winners and losers from the Austrian Grand Prix weekend. Let's move right along to our weekend winners and weekend losers. We have a pair of drivers, one for each, and we'll start now with our weekend winner. I have picked Lando Norris. I think McLaren were really looking to capitalize on these upgrades that they were bringing to the Red Bull ring. We saw with Oscar Piastri, who kind of looked like he was off the pace all weekend. And while we know that Lando is a bit of an Austrian Grand Prix specialist, I think the upgrades that he was able to grab and take advantage of really showed in his results. He finished just outside the points in the sprint race, opting to stay on the inters maybe a bit too long when spinning for slicks might have been a little bit better. But in the Grand Prix, he had the pace and he had the confidence to throw that thing around, and ultimately ends up getting a P4, almost doubling the amount of points McLaren has had in the constructors by himself in this one weekend. And so I think it has to be Lando Norris. If Carlos Sainz might not have had his penalty, he might have been in the running, but ultimately with his 10-second penalty and dropping to P6, I think it really just only makes sense to give it to Lando. So Lando Norris, you are my weekend winner for Austria. And then moving right along to my weekend loser, and it pains me to say this because I really want to see him do well, but it has to be Nick DeVries. Leading up to the race this week, I mean, all we saw online and in the media was all of this talk about how disappointed the higher ups at Red Bull were about picking Nick DeVries and how they might have made a mistake. And I think nothing more would have been needed to kind of put a foot to show them that they put their foot in their own mouth, that Nick have a good weekend. And ultimately he just really did not. In the race, he ends up finishing well near the back. He qualifies near the back. I think he even qualified last for the Grand Prix. And then on race day itself, he finishes P17 and never really had anything going for him. And so with all this talk and conversation about turning to now who's going to replace him, I think it might just be a miracle to save his F1 career at this point, because he has been a little disappointing, and we know that AlphaTauri isn't the most quick car on the grid, we can say. At the same time, he's gonna need some major help to probably save it at this point. I mean, he needs to be beating Yuki every single weekend from here probably till the summer break, and even then, it still might not be enough. So, Nick, I'm very sorry, but you are my weekend loser. We move now to the predictions that I made before the race weekend began and see how they fared after it's all done and wrapped up. And I'm hoping and praying that the FIA and the stewards are done handing out penalties, because at this point, my points are locked and loaded and I will not be revisiting them again. But we'll start now with my pick for biggest positive surprise, and I went. I believed that with Williams giving the upgrades that Alex Albon had in Canada to Logan Sargent, that Williams would do well around the Red Bull Ring, and I predicted that Logan Sargent would have a very good weekend. And while he may not have finished in the points and he may have finished outside the points in the sprint race, a P13 finish in the Grand Prix, a much more impressive feat than I think finishing if he had finished P13 in the sprint race, I might not have counted it if they'd swapped positions with his results in the sprint and in the Grand Prix, maybe. But finishing P13 in the Grand Prix, one of his best results of the year so far. I think he's really needed a good result. He kind of has been on a bit of an upward downward swing so far through the season, and seeing him finish in P13, he was very happy with his result. I think it's more than welcoming. I'm giving myself my point for Logan Sargent being my biggest positive surprise. Moving on to my biggest disappointment. It pained me to say it, but Haas was my pick for biggest disappointment. And if this was just a regular race weekend and not a sprint race weekend, I would have nailed this 1 out of 1, 100% of the time, as Haas finished well outside the points and Nico Hülkenberg didn't even finish the Grand Prix. On the flip side, Nico Hülkenberg finishes P6 in the sprint race, and with Haas getting points, I can't, with all honesty, give myself a 0 here. I'm giving myself a 0.5 out of 1. Now, a Haas finishing in the points, either in the Grand Prix or the sprint, should be celebrated, and so I'm giving myself a half point for Nico finishing in the points, but a dreadful Grand Prix really holds it back from getting a full point. But a half point for my biggest disappointment. Moving forward to my qualifying predictions, I went for a Max Verstappen pole. I mean, this is turning into one of my banker points, I think. I mean, realistically, if I'm going to get any points throughout the race weekend, I know I can always predict a Max pole or a Max win, and I'm probably at this point going to be getting that point. So a Max Verstappen pole, ding ding, that's 1 so far. P2 and P3 I went for Fernando Alonso and Lewis Hamilton, while Merck and Aston Martin severely let me down by being really off the pace. I mean, we saw a fantastic qualifying from Ferrari, but unfortunately for me, that's 1 of 3 in terms of qualifying. So a little L. I will get it 100% one of these days. So it is what it is, 1 of 3 in qualifying. And then this is a sprint race weekend, and so we have my prediction for sprint winner. This, again, a banker point, Max Verstappen. Easy, we don't need to spend that much time on it. The guy was dominant all weekend, and we won't be too surprised when I get to my next prediction. We'll roll right into it. The race results, I predicted a Max Verstappen win, once again, getting my banker point in, and that was that. I then followed it up with a Fernando Alonso P2, did not happen, and a Charles Leclerc P3. So now, hear me out on this. I went bold and picked a Ferrari to finish on the podium in Austria, and while it might have been off by a single place, I'm giving myself a half point for being bold enough to predict a Ferrari on the podium, and so I'm giving myself a half point for my prediction of Charles Leclerc. Even though I put him in P3, he finishes in P2, and I'm giving myself a half point. So 1.5 out of 3 in terms of my race results. And then finally, my Haas predictions of the race weekend. We do this every week, and it's been getting a little dull and a little moribund around here when it comes to my Haas predictions. I've been slowly falling off of the roller coaster in terms of my Haas delusion syndrome. And so my predictions for Haas this weekend were 1 car into Q2, 1 car in the top 15 of the sprint race, and then both cars outside the top 15 for the Grand Prix. Now, we got to a total of 2.5 points on my Haas predictions, and we got there in probably the wildest way. I predicted 1 car into Q2. Kevin Magnussen did not make it into Q2. Nico Hülkenberg made it all the way to Q3, but I'm giving myself my point for Nico Hülkenberg making it into Q2 and beyond. So that is 1 point for that. And then 1 car in the top 15 for the sprint race. I've given myself a half point for this because Nico did finish in the points as well, and Kevin finished also in the top 15. So 2 cars finished in the top 15. That means a half point for me, although I will happily be wrong with a points finish for Haas at any point in a race weekend. And then finally, both cars outside the top 15 for the Grand Prix. Unfortunately, that is a right on the money, as Kevin Magnussen finishes P18 and Nico Hülkenberg DNFs. So I might have been correct to predict a tough finish for the Grand Prix. I still managed to come out on top, 2.5 points out of 3 for my Haas predictions, and Haas finished with points on the weekend. I will never be disappointed with that. But if we do the math, and I believe I did this correctly, I finished with a beautiful 7.5 out of 12 points for a 62.5% for you math whizzes out there. And so a very solid prediction weekend for me. I think Austria is a fantastic race to kind of give predictions, and I felt like I did pretty good until I did the math and I found out I did really good. Anything over 50% I will take every single day of the week, and I hopefully can carry this momentum into Silverstone next weekend. Guys, that was the 2023 Austrian Grand Prix weekend. What did you think of the race? How did your predictions go? Let me know down in the comments below. Are we all excited for Silverstone next weekend? We have a bunch of Grand Prix in a row as we head towards the summer break. I know I'm excited to see what comes next weekend, but that will do it for me here. Let me know what you thought down below. Go ahead, hit that like button and subscribe if you too are a Formula One fan. We do it plenty around here. I think that'll do it for me here. We'll see you guys here in a few days for my Silverstone British Grand Prix predictions. I'm already noodling them in my head. Get them thinking yourself too. And if you want to get involved with the predictions for my predictions video, I give my Discord an opportunity to have their voices heard as well. So head over there, link down below. But that'll do it for me here, and I'll see you guys in the next one.